Hey, it's Mike here, and it has come to my attention that that recent vegan twin study and its Netflix docuseries, You Are What You Eat, the Twin Experiment, have been debunked by multiple people now?
Why the new Netflix show, You Are What You Eat, is a vegan PR stunt based on flawed science.
I will tell you the truth behind this new Netflix documentary called You Are What You Eat. It is absolutely insane what they've done.
The docuseries itself was hanging out at number 3 for popular shows on Netflix, and is still in the top 10, and because of that, it's gotten a lot of attention. And with that, a lot of criticism. The main call is that it should just be completely ignored because it was produced by biased plant-based people, and we're gonna look at the specific criticisms. And I also wanna say this is more or less of an update to the last video I did on this study, because they did show some more results that weren't in the study, in particular on telomeres and gut health. As for the criticism, we are going to look into the methodology, and I'll admit that the study is not perfect, but we have to ask, are the claims being made here still valid? Are the findings still valid? And for a quick spoiler alert, some of the attacks on the study and the documentary are just absolutely demonstrably false. Let's go. Right off the bat, obviously the study has bias. Obviously the documentary was produced by people who think that a plant-based diet is a valid thing. The docuseries also did show that there was quite a bit of interaction between like the study authors and the people who were in the study themselves. So it would have been nice to have a double-blind study where the authors don't know who are on what intervention. That being said, the docuseries was also about telling personal stories, and some of these expose actually some disadvantages in the study for a vegan diet. For example, how pretty much everybody was dreading going on the vegan diet, but would be happy or excited to go on the healthier omnivorous diet.
I'm pretty excited. I'm kind of feeling it for you though, but
I was really praying that I'd be on the omnivore diet.
What?
No, it's fair to say that forced vegan results are likely going to be worse than voluntary vegans out in the wild, which most vegans are. Before we hit on specific criticisms, we just have to refresh the study basics here. We're talking about a randomized control trial by Stanford researchers on 21 sets of twins. You know, the twins were split to either a healthier vegan diet or a healthier omnivorous diet. The idea was to obviously compare people with the same genetics. And we'll ask if it really was a healthy omnivorous diet in a bit, but it's worth mentioning that the first 4 weeks of the study were pre-made meals that were given to them in the mail. Then for the second 4 weeks, they were responsible for cooking their own meals. The results were that the vegans had a statistically significant 14-point drop in cholesterol, 4.5 pounds of weight loss, lowering in insulin, as well as an insulin resistance index, which I personally calculated, that wasn't in the study. And finally, lower TMAO levels, which is a heart disease risk factor, after they took out some outliers. And I want to elaborate on this a little bit because I didn't do it justice in my last video. So the outliers were actually at baseline before any diets were started. The vegan group, the vegan twins, for whatever reason, a couple of them just had super high TMAO, which set things off. And this is where we do have a new piece of information from the docuseries, and that is a quick flashing of the chart that wasn't in the study, and this is the adjusted one. And you can see that starting at the same level, the vegan group just dips way down with about a 40% reduction. And we have to put all these things in context. This is something that we've seen on a vegan diet over and over again. We know the metabolic process by which these vegans are not creating TMAO from animal product precursors. And we also know that if we give people, whether they're vegan or omnivore, more of those precursors, carnitine and choline, their TMAO level goes up, and from this study, their platelet aggregation goes up as well, which is concerning in terms of heart disease. And one point in various YouTube responses, for example, by Lane Norton and Nutrition Made Simple, who weren't even trying to debunk the video, this is before the docuseries, and I agree with 80% of what they said. They were just dismissing TMAO essentially entirely.
Not an agent of risk, not a cause of risk per se. So I'm not particularly worried about TMAO levels, but I'm open to other data in the future that might contradict that.
They also saw a reduction in TMAO, which TMAO may be a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. They're unsure at this point if TMAO is a risk factor or simply a associative biomarker.
But again, the case is building for the mechanism by which TMAO can be harmful. You can pause to read it here. You don't want more of that TMAO-naze. But the docuseries itself did present some new results that weren't in the original study, which was meant to be cardiometabolic risk factors. And that brings us to our results on telomeres, for example. Telomeres are the protective caps on the end of your DNA, and they are a biological marker of aging. It's not just some wacky vegan metric, it's a legit marker. And the length of the telomeres of the twins was the same at baseline before the diets. But as we can see from this chart, the meat eaters ended up with shorter telomeres at the end of just 8 weeks.
Oh my God, I feel so set up. It's like, oh yeah, you omnivores, go on ahead, you know? And we're like, oh yeah, then our telomeres are getting shorter.
Those results are statistically significantly different. I can't wait for them to be published. And that's something I haven't seen anybody criticize about the docuseries or the results of the study. And the guy from the telomere testing company even weighed in.
Typically when we do interventional studies, we try to say about 3 months to 6 months. With an 8-week study, we didn't really expect there to be much of a change. Within 8 weeks, across all of the twins on a vegan diet, that was really interesting and surprising to say the least.
And it's good to remember that all of this does fit into the larger body of data. Like, for example, this meta-analysis showing that vegans had 15% lower cancer risk. Obviously, protecting DNA is going to lower cancer risk. And we have that orange study using a loosely plant-based diet and lifestyle changes showing telomere advantages as well. And regardless of your gut feeling about this study, the gut results were quite interesting, with the vegan diet having statistically significantly higher Bifidobacterium than the meat one. Higher Bifido is associated with less disease in many ways. We'll touch on the benefits in a second. But first, this makes sense for 2 reasons. Number one, Bifido feeds on fiber, and they also can feed on plant antioxidants like polyphenols, as this study mentions. There's more metabolites of polyphenols in people with higher Bifido. Brings me to today's really relevant sponsor, which is, you might have guessed it, Seeds DS01 Daily Synbiotic, which is a prebiotic and a probiotic. And each one of these little guys has 53.6 billion active bacterial cell units from 24 different strains. And guess what? 12 of those strains are Bifidobacterium. So today's theme is going to be the power of Bifido, looking at some randomized control trials that used Bifidobacterium in general. Let's just rapid fire them. Number 1, we see an improved IBS score over placebo in people given Bifidobacterium probiotics. Next trial, it reduces inflammation markers in healthy people, which is awesome, after 8 weeks of probiotics. And then we see in people with metabolic syndrome that it lowered weight, inflammatory markers, and cholesterol. And then we have another one here that's interesting. Would Bifido have psychological effects? That sounds crazy. Well, from this trial, Bifido probiotics alleviated psychological stress over placebo, which is nuts. We're talking about a score that includes like depression, anger, hostility, anxiety, etc. It's like having a tiny little bacteria therapist in your own body helping you feel better. And that's just the tip of the iceberg on these beneficial studies on Bifido. And as you might know, Lindy and I have been taking Seed for about 3 years now and loving the benefits. So if you would like to try Seed's DS01 Daily Symbiotic, click the link below for 25% off your first month supply by using the code Mike25 at checkout. Another fun little segment of the documentary that I again haven't seen criticized was the one on female sexual function, where they essentially had people look at some spicy material and they measured the heat in their groin, which represents blood flow and arousal. This was a really funny segment, and they of course got measurements before the diets and after the different diets, and they found that the vegans were higher.
I mean, you literally have a forest fire. It is truly the most remarkable thing.
Killing the It was
That
the
is
cleaning
the
guy.
largest percentage. Pretty amazing.
However, this was a situation where they just showed anecdotally a few twins and their results. So I don't know if it's going to be published. I don't think any real scientific claims can be made at this point, only that it's interesting and a fun mirror of the little study that they did in Game Changers with the little erections overnight on a plant-based diet, which again were massively increased, of which it's really hard to not make jokes about. Anyway, let's move on to the criticism more generally. A lot of the criticism of this could be just gauged by looking at the Rotten Tomatoes results. I mean, it got a 48% audience score. Obviously, not everybody's liking it. So what are they not liking about it across the board? Again, they're saying that it is biased. Seems like people people are just saying, oh, this is pro-vegan, I'm not. I'm gonna run to Rotten Tomatoes and give this like 0.5 stars just because I don't like what it's saying. 1.5 star review reads, don't be fooled by the title, should be called Why You Should Be a Vegan, calling it heavily one-sided and biased. Another half-star one says, we are all dumber now. Just watch the commercial for Beyond Meat and save yourself some time. And another one said, this is very biased, and in the end, results were not statistically significant to support the claims they were making that vegan is healthier. And just to address that last one really quickly, all of those benefits that I mentioned, LDL, etc., were statistically significantly different. The telomeres and the Bifido ones were statistically significantly different as well. Obviously, we can all agree that there's a degree of bias going on here. I mentioned in my previous video, looking to the conflicts of interest, there was a connection to Beyond Meat there. Santa Cruz Medicinals probably has the most viewed video with about 750,000 on TikTok, mainly hitting on the funding.
Who funded this study? The Vogt Foundation funded the Stanford study. What even is the Vogt Foundation? They say that they want to assist plant-based development. They've made major investments in companies like Beyond Beef, Impossible Foods.
However, there's a difference between something being biased and something being scientifically wrong or actually just invalid. Automatically writing something off like this as fraud is kind of a wild conclusion, and it's just sort of akin to there being a climate change documentary which has connection to the solar industry. Yes, it's funded by industry, but that doesn't mean that climate change is not real. However, if you have a climate change denial documentary that is funded by the oil industry, which has scientifically invalid claims, that's another story. Even criticized it for not showing things like regenerative grazing and beef.
When you watch the documentary, you'll clearly see the bias here. They'll have the owner of Impossible Foods, they had the owner of some company that makes plant-based deli meats. If it were truly unbiased, they would have people who run regenerative farms, grass-fed beef.
My name's Thomas Locke, and I am a regenerative cattle rancher in Northeast Texas. We rotate our cows around the farm using high-density grazing. Come on, y'all. Which is essentially trying to mimic buffalo herds. Come on.
Guys, I was editing this section and I just had to step in and say, it's so obvious that this guy did not actually watch the documentaries. Like, he's just pulling stuff out of his butt.
We certainly don't have the ability to scale regenerative beef production to the level that industrial beef production is. You have to have an enormous amount of land.
And in terms of bias, they didn't even go and try and shoot down, say, the greenhouse gas emission claims associated with regenerative grazing, which I personally have done. No. So a lot of people either didn't actually watch the film, they were just annoyed by that first episode, or they did, and their own bias, just filtered out things to the point where they didn't hear anything that was said. So while there was bias, we have to still zoom out and look at, is there credibility to the study? Well, it was still a randomized control trial on genetically identical people, published in a prestigious journal, JAMA one, as well as done by researchers from a prestigious university, Stanford. And it goes without saying that it was peer-reviewed science, at least what was published already. So let's look at some of the actual study methodology criticisms here right off the bat. We've got a couple reviews that sum up what people said pretty well. A 1-star review says, another pro-veganism documentary incorrectly evaluating plant versus meat, which is closer to processed versus unprocessed food. I found this one ironic because a lot of the criticism is like, oh, you're pushing these processed Beyond Meat burgers, but then the diet is actually too unprocessed and that's why it's not fair. Next, another 1-star, they say, they do the same thing all these shows do, call the standard American diet a meat-based diet. No one learns anything from this type of biased show. But to be fair, I don't think the docuseries did a good enough job of showing how much healthier the omnivorous diet was than the standard American diet. But to just put this to rest, we have some solid differences. The numbers are that the meat-based group lowered the refined grain intake by 50%, the refined sugar intake by 40% in the provided meat meals, increased vegetable intake by 50% to 5.5 servings a day, which is conservatively twice the standard American diet intake, considering from this study that 60% of people in the US didn't meet the 2.5 serving minimum of fruit and vegetables combined. They also lowered saturated fat intake by 20%. They lowered the amount of calories. That's just 70% of a standard American diet calorie intake, according to the USDA. And they doubled the fish intake, which is conventionally viewed as healthy. They also reduced processed meat intake in the form of cold cuts by half. So by virtually all metrics here, this is healthier than the standard American diet. It's obviously a healthier diet. But to be fair, there was one point that stuck out that I heard some people mention, and that was, why did the meat intake go up from baseline? It seems like they've totally manipulated this study and they need to be put in jail. And to be fair, looking at this chart, it seems like there's a dramatic increase in meat consumption over baseline, but we have to look at one important detail, and that is that when they planned the meals, they didn't have a baseline amount, and this baseline level was lower than the standard American meat consumption level. To be fair, they did leave their meat consumption up around the average American, although a higher portion of it was fish, but not all of it. And this is an interesting criticism because you are admitting that more meat is less healthy, which implies that people who eat less meat, like vegans, would be healthier. But yeah, we don't know why the twins on baseline were eating less meat, maybe because a lot of them were in California. But because they didn't have the baseline nutritional data till a week or less from study start, it means that their meals were likely already in the mail. And finally, we have to ask, did that increased meat lead to some unfair increase in LDL? Well, the LDL stayed the same in that group throughout the whole study, so that lower 20% saturated fat, helped them out there. And to further support the notion that a healthier omnivorous diet is still beaten out by a vegan diet, we have this randomized crossover trial, which switches diets back and forth and there's a higher level of rigor. The vegan period dropped 15 points of LDL, Mediterranean stayed the same, and the vegan period showed weight loss, which was regained clearly on the Mediterranean period from this chart. Another red flag that was raised was the calorie consumption. People are saying, hey, the calorie consumption looks notably lower in those vegans. Clearly, they just fixed that so that they would get some better numbers. Well, we have to remember that the higher fiber and water content means that people are going to be more satiated. That's one of the main advantages of a vegan diet. And Lane Norton, who isn't vegan, touches on this calorie issue.
Now, they didn't instruct them to eat a deficit, but they just ended up eating in a slight calorie deficit, probably because they were more satiated, which, hey, that's possibly a benefit because they're not prescribing them a certain number of calories. They just told them, hey, eat until you feel satisfied.
Yes, calorie consumption remained lower even in the cook for yourself 4-week portion there. So it likely is a result of the actual composition of plant-based foods. And to be fair, with that increased vegetable consumption to 5.5 servings a day in the meat group, there was a significant drop in calories there as well, just not quite as much. Next, we have the body composition criticism for weight loss. There were some DEXA scans in the video. We don't know if all 21 of the twin sets were DEXA scanned. It wasn't published. Will it be published? I don't know. But various people like Nick Norwitz on his YouTube channel have criticized this, saying, oh, we saw some muscle loss in that vegan group. How do we know all of the weight loss in the study wasn't just muscle loss?
Here's, one set of twins, Michael and Charlie. So again, just to highlight, the omnivorous twin gained more muscle and lost more fat. And the vegan twin lost less fat, but also lost muscle. So that's where the benefit, heavy quotes there, of the vegan diet on the weight was.
This is anecdotal, which is frustrating because in the documentary, Charlie specifically couldn't do the weight lifting routine to the same extent as his mediating twin because of family issues, which is frustrating that there were differences in those DEXA scan twins in terms of how much they were exercising, and that hurt a vegan diet. For example, there was one woman who just decided she wanted to walk instead of do the workout on her vegan diet because she's always just walked. And this is where it was a little bit frustrating to see that they just ratcheted up the protein consumption in the meat group so much more than baseline. And we can see in figure 5 here, there's a huge disparity in the protein intake that wasn't necessary at all for the study. And regardless of the diets that these two groups, that those two bars were eating, you're going to see a muscle difference. However, I need to emphasize that from studies like this one, it is the amount, not animal versus plant protein, that is determinant of the muscle mass that people have on their body. And it's funny that the critiques focus on that muscle part, but they don't focus on, for example, the lower visceral fat in the vegans. We had one twin set where one of them stayed exactly the same in terms of visceral fat, and the other one went basically down to undetectable visceral fat. And of course, visceral fat is inflammatory and up in your organs. You really don't want it. But in terms of bias, they could have easily edited out any of the worst muscle situations for particular twin sets. They didn't. And the DEXA scans were a cool sort of storytelling thing, but again, we don't have scientific data on that. Another point worth covering is saturated fat. People seem to just be triggered by the fact that it had the mainstream view that saturated fat increases LDL cholesterol, which increases heart disease risk. We had a comment like this one at 0.5 stars saying saturated fat and a little bacon won't do any harm to you. Actually, it is healthy. Another one said saturated fat is not bad for you. We also have a YouTuber who tries to take down the saturated fat LDL connection. Here he is.
So if LDL-C was the major cause of atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease, people with the highest LDL-C, you would think, should have shorter lives than people with low values, right? Well, in a recent systematic review of 19 cohort studies with more than 68,000, this fills up an entire football stadium, more than 68,000 elderly people of age 60 or older, the researchers found that the opposite was true, that the higher the LDL-C, the longer they lived.
There was actually an inverse association with LDL and mortality. Oh my God, case closed. I should just quit being vegan. But this study has been literally torn to shreds. There was an official, Oxford University response to this. The British Heart Foundation responded to this as well. And they responded with receipts. Number one, they fluffed up their study count when the majority of those studies didn't even include mortality data. Number two, they used a limited search criteria to conveniently exclude studies that were against their own conclusion. Number three, they relied on one study for 2/3 of the population of their whole meta-analysis when that study failed to make basic adjustments and thereby failed their own inclusion criteria, but they let it in anyway. And number four, they didn't exclude people on statins, who were of course put on them because they have a really high risk of dying of heart disease, and the result of that medication is lowering their LDL. Basic crap. And finally, several of the authors, as the study mentions, have written books criticizing the cholesterol hypothesis. The main author literally wrote the book on cholesterol myths, cholesterol denial book. But this is a situation where they were biased, but it isn't the bias alone that makes the study invalid. It was, the entire methodology. And we can contrast that study to the large body of evidence that is randomized Mendelian or genetic studies looking at genetically different LDL, showing that higher means more mortality from heart disease.
And the major thing they talked about was, the group that went vegan lowered their cholesterol. Yeah, if you stop eating meat, you will lower your cholesterol. But the
Santa Cruz Medicinals also ironically cites a review by these same cholesterol denial authors, and we know how they do studies.
There's a lot of really intelligent doctors right now who think that might not be the only goal of human health.
And also a review that relies on directly dairy-funded studies like the Siri Torino one, also some retracted articles, and even random olive oil studies that are just a stretch, totally bogus stuff. And to switch topic, there was a lot of criticism just on the idea that the documentary wasn't what people wanted it to be. It looked like it was going to be cool science, but they had to throw in a bunch of these pro-vegan points. Why did they talk about the environment? Why did they have to show these particular stories? I agree with the factory farming being bad, but meat can be good, not mentioning that 99% of the meat that anybody's going to eat today is factory farmed. But all these points were relevant to the story, talking about plant-based eating. I mean, the Amazon destruction they covered is huge. The other environmental impacts, Eric Adams' story of how he was going blind from diabetes and then he switched to a vegan diet and got rid of that.
But he said the real problem you're facing for your vision loss is that you are type 2 diabetic. I had no idea I was, and he said you're going to lose your sight in probably a year or so.
Or everybody hating on that Michelin star restaurant, deciding to go vegan, but then it wins another star. All of these are really interesting that apply to the overall reason for doing the study as well. So it's clear that we're at the point in society where if there's any inkling that there's pro-plant-based people presenting any information, people are just going to reject it and put their head in the sand. And again, this really is similar to people who are climate deniers just rejecting anything that has to do with climate science and that's been done by a climate scientist. Oh my God, they said eat more plants. I'm gonna run to Rotten Tomatoes and give this 1/2 of a star because me no feel goody. And again, industry connections are important. Industry can really muddy things and bias things, but does that industry science have scientifically invalid methodology? And even zooming out, is it going against what the scientific consensus is? That plant-based foods have a ton of antioxidants and are healthy for you, and all this other data by even people that aren't vegan showing that vegans have better disease outcomes. Like, one of the main findings of the study was that the vegans had lower LDL. I don't think there's a single study out there that shows that vegans have higher LDL. So the main point is that health findings like that, showing that vegans are at a lower risk for our leading disease, are valid. Now, the study might have had some bias and it might have had some issues here and there, but none of them were nearly big enough. None of them were methodologically flawed enough to come up with bogus results entirely. Now, the other group was not eating a standard American diet. I showed you all of the differences. So yeah, not only did this match scientific consensus, this was a randomized control trial, again, that was on genetically identical people with a prestigious journal from prestigious university, peer-reviewed, and all that good stuff. Anyway, if you also want to be rolling in the Bifido, you can try Seed's DS01 Daily Symbiotic by just clicking the link below and using the code Mike25 at checkout for 25% off your first month's supply. That's it. Let me know down below if there's anything about the study that I missed or just got wrong. And of course, feel free to like, subscribe, all that other good stuff. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.